No further ado, we should move over. And Brian, do you want to introduce Toni?
I do. I'm delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, Toni Nemia. Toni is the executive director of the Center for Child and Family Development at the Western Institute for Social Research, where we both work. She has a MS degree in counseling psychology with a specialty in marriage and family therapy, which she got from San Francisco State University. She also has a second master's degree, Master of Arts in Literacy in Secondary Education, also from San Francisco State University. And her bachelor's degree was an English major with an anthropology minor from the University of California in Berkeley. As the executive director of the Center for Child and Family Development, Toni manages the school-based family counseling program, which is the largest program of its type in the United States. And Toni has her hand in clinical and all program aspects of this training program, which operates in San Francisco. Outside of that role, she has a small sliding fee private practice in San Francisco where she sees clients. As an outside supervisor, she also works with master's level clinicians who are working towards their MFT, PCC, and social work licenses, primarily for school-based emphasis. Toni has a 40-year history with the San Francisco Unified School District, first as a high school reading specialist, then as a licensed MFT, when she segued into school mental health with a joyous leap, she says. Supervision is her current passion. She is a member of the board of the Institute for School-Based Family Counseling. And Toni says she can't go a day without reading, and she longs for enough time to re-engage with her micro petty point. Toni identifies as cisgender, and as a multiracial Jew, she is committed to anti-racist work and knows full well how much privilege she has been afforded. Please welcome her now, beginning her talk on adverse childhood experiences, ACES, then and now. And I will share my screen with her slides.
Thank you, everybody. Suzanne, I think that you should get up here beside me because you really have, I think, quite a realistic understanding of ACES. And so please feel free to chime in at any time. So where did this all begin? In 1997, there was a big research study conducted by Kaiser Permanente in, back up, Brian, please. Thank you. One more back. Thanks. There was a very large study. I see that the number 35,000 middle-class individuals, and I must confess, someone made a typo. They multiplied the number by 2. There were 17,500, a robust study conducted between Kaiser Permanente and the Center for Disease Control. Interestingly enough, the original study was actually taking a look at patients at Kaiser in a weight loss program. And Dr. Folletti explains it, that they were baffled. Everyone in the program lost weight, and a year later, they would re-interview people, and the weight had been regained. There had been no follow-up in between. So some of this ACES work has really taken off, but in, I guess I would say, in pockets, both nationally and internationally. And the concept of toxic stress, along with ACES, has really reshaped fields of medicine, mental health, public health and policy, law, legislation, and education. In terms of the United States, we are starting to see a tapestry which is filling it. If you think about the full picture of a tapestry, right now, the weaving of ACEs is in patches, not necessarily with everything connected yet, but certainly the movement has taken off worldwide. And the hope is that this movement will really take hold and treat people differently who have suffered trauma. The surprising fact about this study was that basically these folks were lower middle class, middle class, upper middle class. And there was a cross section, as you can see, of race. Everyone had Kaiser benefits. That meant that they were working. Many had attended college. And the bulk of the participants were not necessarily from under-resourced or underprivileged backgrounds. Average age was 57. So what are these? ACEs are adverse childhood experiences which profoundly harm a developing child, especially the brain and the body. And the study yielded that these roots of trauma were responsible in an evidence-based way for disease, mental illness, and a lot of societal problems. The original 10 ACEs were measured through questions. And we'll take a look in the next slide at the scenarios that were being discussed. So each of the categories here, and then where the parentheses are, represents how many questions dealt with each topic. Emotional, physical, and sexual abuse had 3 questions. There were 2 dealing with physical and emotional neglect. There was 1 question dealing with whether the mom in the family had been treated violently. Was there any mental illness in the household? Had there been a rupture in the relationship between the parents? And had anyone been incarcerated in the household? And this was the focus of the original 10 ACEs. So Dr. Folletti describes what he refers to as his aha moment. Looking back at the fact that this was a weight loss study, and then everybody had gained the weight back, upon re-interviewing and trying to understand what had happened to folks who had been so successful in the weight loss program and yet had regained the weight, he decided we haven't been asking the right questions. And I think this turning point is extremely important for all of us in the helping professions, especially those of us who work in psychotherapy, counseling, and also teachers in the classroom. So instead of looking at a person's condition and wondering what they did to cause the condition, to somehow have an ownership in the condition, the language shifted in general to a question that really focused on the client, the patient, which is what happened, or tell me what happened to you. Lots of work in neurobiology and the concept of toxic stress has emerged. I know we talk about stress and distress. We look at anxiety in a problematic way, except a little bit of anxiety can be really helpful to launch people forward. But what we're talking about in toxic stress is that there is such a flood of hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, that invade the body, kind of like a perfect storm. And this is not a healthy situation. I'm having a little bit of stress, for example, right now. Let's hope that this stress keeps me in a state of launching forward and offering my best. However, if I become overloaded with these hormones, I could likely get into a fight, flee the screen, or perhaps freeze and become paralyzed. I don't intend to do any of those things. With younger children, this kind of hormone storm really affects the brain in problematic ways. So this is an example of where the body takes a real beating.
Everybody, please mute your screen. Mute your microphone.
Thank you. And blood pressure goes up. Over time, this causes a weakening of the heart, the circulatory system. Diabetes is often a known byproduct of being in a constant state of toxicity, and many inflammatory responses causing a host of diseases take over. What ends up happening over time with toxic stress is that the body loses its capacity to return to a baseline, a more balanced state. Think of a rubber band that gets stretches and it's so taut. And then over time, you allow the rubber band to move from the taut to the relaxed position, and it becomes more flaccid. It can't regroup. And the biomedical researchers are suggesting that these childhood traumas become embedded. They become a part of us. And no, we don't forget them, maybe at the conscious level, some people might say, but we really carry them with us. If you think about children in the classroom, or adults for that matter, they tend to be very tightly wound. The routine response is not a response, but a reaction. And there's this hair trigger quality. For those of you who have worked with children in the classroom, I'm sure you've seen how they can go from A to Z in a moment's notice. And the fact is, I've encountered adults who experience that same extreme reaction. So I'm going to self-disclose. I am not ACE free. I've taken the original ACES survey, and I want to say at this point, if you would like a copy of that survey, I would be happy to include it in an email to you. It is in fact the original. And the thinking is that the more ACEs one accrues, the more likely one is for physical illness and also a fair amount of mental stress. to say nothing of what it does in, let's say, the life of a child from 0 to 3, back to all of the physical conditions that are caused by trauma. Notice that a fair amount of those are in the autoimmune category. It's as if the body attacks itself. Next. So this is where we talk about historical and generational trauma. And the term epigenetics gets introduced. What we've always believed is that there is a fixed quality in our genetic structure. And through the ACES study, we're learning, number one, that is not the case, and that actually this genetic material goes through, runs through the generations. I think probably the Holocaust studies were one of the first to take a look at how a trauma with magnitude can affect so many people. And then once the actual trauma is removed, the legacy stays throughout children and grandchildren's lives. The resilience research actually tells us that the brain is plastic and that there's a fair amount of hope that even with a load of ACEs, which have taken grip within our bodies and spirits, that there's mitigation that can be used and that trauma not need necessarily be a lifelong sentence. I would guess that any sort of, I'm thinking about what happens worldwide when segments of our population are targeted and then annihilated. And there are many kinds of holocausts. One can understand the worldwide effect that transgenerational passing of trauma can have. So ACEs are common throughout all populations. The fact is that people who are poor are more heavily afflicted, given the opportunities that they lack. In the study, women and people of color tend to be at greater risk for 4 or more ACEs. And of course, the more ACEs you have, the increase for negative outcomes is profound. This slide deals a little bit with this concept of epigenetics and how it connects to generational trauma. The picture that you see is of Native Americans in the United States of America. And if you think about what has happened historically to Native Americans, the fit around generational trauma makes a lot of sense. So rather than fixed genes, in other words, things staying the same, what we now know is that epigenetics, which literally means above the genome, can actually be pinged and touched. And so how we start out is not necessarily how we end up. So toxic stress can be a real ping maker. It just pings and pings along the genetic line. And that's where we start to see the changes in both body and mind. The belief has now been challenged. The kinds of quotes that you hear around epigenetics include the following two. The idea that genes load the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. And this speaks to the fact that we are not necessarily all captains of our fate, mistresses of our destiny. It speaks more to the idea that we live in sick contexts, problematic contexts. Bessel van der Kolk's quote shows up in much of ACES work, and it's a profound one in that it suggests that we stockpile ACEs. They don't dissipate. And what's happened to us takes a toll and loads our system. Many people looked at that first survey that was given in the ACES study and said, wait a minute, this is a narrow kind of view. And since then, there's been an expansion, and this is hardly the full laundry list of all of the kinds of things that people endure growing up in current times. And it's not as if any of the work around ACES is only centered on those first areas. The fact is, tragedy and trauma come in a variety of ways. And if you think about the concept of toxic stress, many of these situations occur over time. And it's important to remember that attitude, living conditions, not necessarily an earthquake, a tidal wave, or a natural disaster are what causes trauma. I mean, those events certainly do, but some of these occurrences are more insidious. Those of us engaged in anti-racism work really emphasize that systemic racism and poverty are a common condition for many children and adults in terms of ACEs. Next. So this is kind of the age-old refrain. Those in power, those with the money, those who have resources in general do better, even with ACEs. But the greatest burden falls on people without power, without resources. Certainly my experience in the San Francisco Unified School District, not only as a reading specialist, but also as an MFT, shows me very vividly that there is a great disparity in suffering. And I'm only highlighting that because of the times that we live in, not to necessarily suggest that ACEs don't cross all strata of society. They certainly do. But if you take a look at the masses, that's where the core of suffering is living. So racism and classism, sexism, goes on and on. That's what perpetuates adverse childhood experiences. Dr. Nadine Burke Harris is currently California State Surgeon General. Many have referred to her as a woman of valor. There's another expression about women holding up half the sky. And she's certainly one who has breathed a very forceful life into the ACES movement, not just in California. She started in San Francisco, but also nationally and internationally. She's also the author of a book, The Deepest Well Suzanne, I think you were referring to the Center for Youth Wellness, which is a clinic out in the Hunters Point Bayview district of San Francisco, primarily inhabited by Black and brown people. And one of the things that was stunning for her in her initial pediatric practice at the clinic was the number of referrals for children with ADHD and ADD. Now, the diagnosis, the label had primarily come from teachers and administrators, mostly in public schools in San Francisco. And certainly during my years with the district, this diagnosis was a kind of catch-all. I now realize that it was an inaccurate catch-all. Yes, there definitely are children and adults with ADHD and ADD, but the fact was these children who were being referred were, this was not a mass diagnosis. And this is where Dr. Burke-Harris sort of shifted the conversation and explored family histories. And almost to a child, she was stunned by the occurrence of family trauma. And so what was happening? What was happening was not necessarily ADHD as the primary diagnosis. It just mirrored ADHD in terms of the hormone flood, the toxic stress. So the bigger picture and the hope is that many different sectors of a community will come together and start to interconnect in ways that we hadn't thought of before. Let me give you a very minor example. In Tennessee right now, there is a relationship between the police department and the schools. And it's a positive relationship in which if there is a call to a home and there is a child in that home of school age, and let's say the call is around domestic violence or child abuse, or something that is distressing in the home, police actually contact the school, not in a tattletale way, but in a way to let staff know that a child may be coming into the building who has really had a rough night, or who has had a just rough lifetime experience. And the kind of wraparound with caring adults really is a mitigating factor for trauma. If you take a look and expand this to all of these arenas, we would be holding our arms around a lot more children. Next. So perhaps some of you know better than I of what's happening with ACES at the international level. We know that WHO, World Health Organization, and the CDC are starting to look at prevention, and they're studying low and middle income children internationally, trying to get a better understanding of what the long-term health risks are associated with ACEs. Brazil is exploring bullying and its impact on children. Chile right now is looking at depression in children. Next. Next slide. Japan has been studying the long-term effects of ACEs and aging. And it was Scotland, was the first nation that declared itself an ACEs nation. And this was all in recognition of the effects of paternal alcoholism on little boys. The newest headline is that France is acknowledging a deep-rooted societal problem of sexual abuse. This has been within the last couple of weeks in the headlines. So back to that question, which is what happened? Not what did you do, or why did you do it, or how did you get this? Linked with another profound question, which is where are the adults? Takes us to the next couple of slides. You see a picture of children at the border. The children with the little kimonos on are Uyghur children who've been taken from their families and are now in Chinese orphanages. That sea of little faces are Native American children who've been removed from their homes and placed in orphanages in the name of something better. These children here are Palestinian children who are behind a chain link fence. Keep going. My upper left shows a flooded area. These children are from Rohingya, and they are in a camp. This is actually a First Nation girl from Canada, sort of expressing, I think, a too often held wish, which is I want to grow up in a community of my people. Concentration camps during World War II. And if you take a look at this last picture, these are poor white people living in, not necessarily behind chains, but living in squalor. Next slide. So one of the questions that gets asked is, are we doomed? There was a book, a Broadway play and a movie back in the 1940s here in the United States of America called The Snake Pit. And it was a terrifying story of a woman's journey in a mental institution. Now, the drama, the real life drama of what it meant to be institutionalized in such an asylum certainly was our legacy for quite a while. The good news is things are much better. We tend to treat mentally ill people differently than was portrayed in The Snake Pit. And we are by no means home free. People are living in a snake pit on a daily basis, in households and on the street. Next slide. So we're going to kind of segue gently into where is the hope? Are we doomed? Not necessarily. This does not have to be our destiny. What the science has told us is that the brain is plastic and the body wants to heal. All of the work that has been done with stroke victims, people who have suffered traumatic brain injuries, allows us to know in living proof that the baseline can shift. If we can mitigate toxic stress in supportive ways, a lot of the stress-related conditions can be undone. What we do know is that if one practices, a good, healthy lifestyle, that these kinds of behaviors actually work against the reactivity that people have been living with. This slide looks good on paper, and I think it's important to know that for many people, this is not done in isolation. These kinds of health-oriented tasks often come and should come from teachers, from counselors, therapists, from doctors. Next slide. One of the things that is being looked at right now with the ACES work are what are called 5 protective factors. And the ACES movement really tries to take families and work with the whole system so that people can learn other ways. And this is where therapy, holistic medicine, whole child medicine, integrative medicine is really important. But again, it needs a direction and it needs a director. When I look at just the 5 protective factors, we've been able to see that even when children have lived in trauma, that the trauma can be mitigated by 1 or more of these and has been, in fact, mitigated. So when we're questioning folks about what has happened, it's important to look for the protective factors and call those out, because those were the strengths in the family. Next one. Resilience is another term, kind of byproduct of the ACES study. And what it refers to is one's own capacity to adjust, to cope, if you will. Looking at these suggestions for coping as a way of building resilience, again, can't be done in isolation. And this is where the helping community, I think, is absolutely fundamental in the classroom, in the clinics, in the psychotherapy hour. And what we do know is one close attachment makes all the difference in the world. And this, I think, is where therapists and teachers do come in. Next slide. So these are just more in the laundry list. There's nothing earth-shaking about any of these strategies toward healing and health. But once again, how does someone who's been devoid of these kinds of experiences even begin to learn of them if there is not a guiding person? And that's who we are, the guiding people. Next slide. Take a look at this particular list. Some people have these characteristics inherently and don't even know that they have them. Some people have them and have lost touch with them. Because I'm thinking about this in our work at the center with children and teens through education and counseling, we pay attention to helping students, our clients, identify where some of these elements are already happening, but have not been brought to the fore. Next one. So this is where I'm going to involve you a bit. I apologize that this was not a more interactive presentation. When I do it with folks studying to become licensed clinicians, teachers, administrators, I often try to engage them throughout the conversation. And recently, a teacher said to me, I don't do any of those things. I'm not going to run. It makes me sick. Next slide. So what good does it say to someone, run a little more, and maybe that adrenaline will kick in and you're going to feel great. You know, eat well, get plenty of sleep. We've heard this over and over. Some people are really good at making use of these strategies, and some people have no use for any of it. And it's not because they don't want to feel better, or they're not they're not motivated because of how sick they feel. Next slide. So I'm going to do a little summary here and say to you, help people find what works for them. And it may not look like the laundry list of really important steps that one can take. At the risk of self-referencing, I don't meditate, I don't do mindfulness, but I do breathe. And this poem is something I read regularly. This is what brings me, keeps me mostly on the path of resilience. And I'd like to read it to you on the chance that it perhaps speaks to you, or maybe speaks to the folks that you work with who are not about to jump on a bandwagon of health and wellness through strategies. So read along with me. Breathe, said the wind. How can I breathe at a time like this when the air is full of the smoke of burning tires, burning lives? Just breathe, the wind insisted. Easy for you to say if the weight of injustice is not wrapped around your throat, cutting off all air. I need you to breathe. I need you to breathe. Don't tell me to be calm when there are so many reasons to be angry, so much cause for despair. I didn't say to be calm, said the wind. I said to breathe. We're going to need a lot of air to make this hurricane together. Thank you all for listening. I sent you a video so that you can hear Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris's talk. She's incredibly dynamic, wonderful to listen to. Any chance I get, I do go to hear her. I understand that if you want to bring her to your agency, she's now about $10,000. So I recommend the YouTube video for sure. I'd like to see all your faces again.
Thank you, Toni. I have one more thing to add after your wonderful presentation as a resource for people. In the California Surgeon General's office, they've published a free manual. It's like 400 pages on ACEs, but there may be chapters that people would benefit from some of the information in there, and it's completely free on the California Surgeon General's website.
Thank you so much for that. By all means, free is a good price. It's a bargain, and there'll be a lot of bang for the buck there. You know, we're out of time, and I recognize I've talked your faces off.
We have time for maybe 10 minutes of questions.
Okay.
And Sue's going to moderate this.
So my question back to you is, what do you think of all of this? What do you make of all of this? Is it new? I'm really interested in hearing what your impressions are, what your takeaways are. So thank you for sharing those.
I would love to intervene. Can I?
Yes.
I think I had observed ACEs intuitively my whole life. I am originally from Colombia, which is a third world country. I started tutoring children when I was 14 years old. My original formation is as a linguist. And then I studied communications and literature. And I worked with every age group, teaching English in Colombia, in schools, universities, and in corporate environments. And I've taught Spanish in the US. And I could just intuitively see ACEs. And in my own mother, my mother had arthritis. And I have a podcast right now where I tell her story, trying to teach people about intergenerational trauma. And when I read The Deepest Well, when it first came out, because I saw Dr. Nadine Burke on a TED Talk, it was like looking the deepest well. That's what's poisoning us. That's what's poisoning us and our societies. And this is worldwide. And this is so prevalent in all of South and Central America. So I've always wanted to be a voice and to be a light. And if I can help in any way, because there's still a lot of ignorance about this. Why do we have children in cages? Why right now in Texas, why are brown and black people most affected by this disaster? This is so pervasive and it's structural. And so if we really implement a trauma-informed government, a faith, education, we could change the future. This is the only way to change the future. And so thank you. I feel like I'm being led. The universe truly responds to your heart and your wishes and your deepest desires. And I see it right here. Thank you.
I would like to make a comment. Sorry for joining late. I almost forgot this was Saturday morning, so I was about 30 minutes late, but I really enjoy your talk. On a personal note, I'm doing the work that I'm doing because of ACE, and I did not have a full understanding of ACE. I'm just kind of gradually learning about ACE, and I see the connection. I see how it impacts people, and even in my own family. My sister was born with cleft palate, and she grew up in a culture where having a disability or birth defect was considered a bad luck. And my parents did not know how to address it. And so they kept it quiet. They didn't talk about it. They just kind of, let be. And I saw my sister grow up with the emotional, negative emotion in her self-concept and the choices that she made. It affected her whole life. And I have seen her living through stress and unable to manage those stress. And now she is diagnosed with Parkinson's and has had Parkinson's for over 10 or 15 years and is now in a assisted living facility, unable to move. And the stress that had caused her. And, looking at the past culture and society where very, domestic violence was pretty much accepted, thinking that it's okay for males to discipline females or whatever. And kids witnessing that parents or having relationship problems and all that. So, even in personal lives, people face ACE all the time. And sometimes these parents are not receptive to help because they have these maladaptive way of coping, and they, avoid, deny for whatever self-protection reasons. And these are the families who, even when help is offered, might not always take the offer because they're not aware of their situation or have a lot of defenses or what. So I see it all the time. And I really appreciate this talk because it kind of confirms the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. And it's so much bigger than what we initially thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. That was Dr. Helen Sung, who is an Oxford Symposium and School-Based Family Counseling member.
I had noticed that Eileen had raised her hand, and I wonder, we have a few more minutes. Eileen, would you like to say something?
Well, I just want to thank Toni for a very, it's such a charged topic, and you did it in such a calming way. I think you presented it in a way that allowed people and probably allows people to really absorb the potency of the information. Because of course, whenever we hear about that, we reflect upon our own ACEs. And we all have some, right, that are either adversity or trauma. And I guess I want to ask you a question. I've created some documents for physicians because I work in integrative health. I noticed that many of my patients over the last 35 or 40 years, I think I got into trauma work because I saw that adverse childhood experiences were an important link back. And I work with dementia or chronic fatigue syndrome. And so I see endpoint stuff. And about 35 years ago, I started doing my own research thinking, oh, interesting that this illness came up around a trauma, that there were certain hits. Then looking back to ACEs. So I guess my specific question to you, first of all, thank you. And my specific question is there a place for any of the documents that I've written for practitioners, healthcare informed, trauma informed care? And a reflection from you also on what do you see the link between ACEs and dementia? I mean, I've researched it, written about it, but do you have comments about it that would be helpful to me?
Well, geographically, there actually may be an ACES connection consortium right where you live. So what we should take a look at is where do you live, and look at a website known as ACES Connections.
Oh, okay, good.
And you can begin to speak to this. It's an incredible international blog. People present and hold workshops through ACES Connections. And somehow I want to manage to get these resources to you, and maybe Sue, Brian, and I can figure out a way just in an email blast so that you can get a resource page that might be of help. The other thing I would like to add is there's a sequel to this presentation, and the natural link for the center and people who work with children is schools, and to look at schools of havens as havens of resilience. So that's an area where we would really like to move full force and are working on such now. And just as Suzanne pointed out that there are challenges in moving this message, trust me, some of the biggest challenges are getting institutions of education to flex with us.
That's great. Great information, because I'm giving a big talk in London and I really want to be able to speak to the implementation of trauma and ACEs informed care. So I'd love to mention those places.
So just please email me and we'll connect.
Thank you.
I think we have to acknowledge that we're at a place where we probably need to stop. But I want to say just thank you, Toni, for it was a beautiful presentation. And I know that we all learned, even if we're familiar with pieces of this story. Your presentation really guided the story of ACEs in a way that was very meaningful. So thank you. And I'm sure everyone would, there it is. There's your the applause coming from all corners. So Let me hand this back over to Brian. Do you have any words you want to say, Brian?
Yeah, I think all those birds you heard are in Tony's room.
Yeah.
If you wondered what was going on there, she's a bird lover par excellence, and you probably saw the picture of her with the peacock that she uses for working with children. So thank you, Toni. Fabulous presentation. Thank you, everybody. We've recorded this. We will be posting it on our website so that you can view it at a later time, and others who couldn't see it can view it as well. So thank you, everybody. See you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Toni.
Thank you.
Thank you.